Welcome to the Appalachian Historical Review. This is the audio home for AppalachianGenealogy.com. Each week, we dig into the records, migration paths, and the real stories of the people who settled the Appalachian Range. We're here to look at the actual documents and the everyday lives that define our heritage. Now, let's step into the records and look at what the documents themselves reveal.
You know, if you look at your kitchen table right now, there's probably a salt shaker just sitting there.
Oh, yeah, almost certainly.
I mean, it's completely mundane. It costs maybe $1 at the grocery store. You don't even think twice about it.
Right. It's practically invisible to us today because it's just everywhere. We take that kind of foundational resource completely for granted.
But if you rewind the clock to the upland South in 1862, that little white crystal isn't just a basic seasoning.
No, not at all.
In a pre-refrigeration world, it is the literal difference between life and death. The resulting crisis over that simple commodity generated a massive, hidden paper trail that reshaped the entire Appalachian region.
Yeah, the shortage fractured the existing economy so severely that it forced entirely new legal frameworks into existence across 13 different states.
Wow, 13 states.
Yeah. It dictated daily survival, it altered migration patterns, and, it compelled county clerks to document populations that rarely made it into formal ledgers.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Whether you are a seasoned genealogist hunting down an elusive ancestor, or you are just insanely curious about the hidden engines of history, we are going to reveal how the Civil War salt shortage in Appalachia is actually a genealogical goldmine.
For sure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because lacking salt wasn't just a minor inconvenience for these communities. It was a catastrophic collapse of their entire agricultural cycle.
Exactly. Without salt, the 19th century agricultural system it stops functioning entirely. You cannot cure pork or beef.
Yeah.
You cannot keep your livestock healthy because animals need salt licks to survive the winter. Yeah. You can't even tan leather for shoes or harnesses. It was the foundational preservative.
So it's woven into literally everything they do to survive.
Oh, absolutely. When the sudden violent scarcity of this one resource hit, it altered daily life so profoundly that local courts, county committees, and state governments had to create entirely new types of records just to manage the fallout.
To really understand how a household crisis generates a statewide paper trail, we first have to understand the physical geography of salt, right? Yeah. Like, we need to look at how this commodity moved people and capital before the war even started.
Yeah, you really have to structure this chronologically to see the full picture, because long before 1860, the Appalachian interior was already deeply dependent on 4 major inland salt centers.
Okay, what were those?
So you had Saltville in southwestern Virginia, you had the Kanawha Valley, which was then in Virginia and is now West Virginia, and in Kentucky you had 2 massive hubs, Goose Creek in Clay County and Leatherwood in Perry County.
And these weren't just small backyard setups either, right? I mean, the mechanics of producing this much salt required serious industrial infrastructure.
Oh, massive infrastructure. They were pumping brine from deep wells and boiling it down in these huge 50-gallon cast iron kettles.
That sounds incredibly labor-intensive.
It was. The sheer volume of timber required to keep those furnaces burning 24/7 meant they were clearing entire forests.
Wow. And to move that massive volume of salt out of those valleys and into the remote mountain hollows, they had to build a vast network of turnpikes, dredged river routes, and winding wagon roads.
Yes, exactly. They penetrated deep into the Appalachian interior, connecting these highly isolated communities to global capital.
It kind of completely flips the traditional way we map out family trees. If we look at these early 1800 supply chains, they functioned almost like an early interstate highway system.
That's a great way to put it.
Did these trade routes essentially become migration highways for families?
They absolutely did. If we connect this to the bigger picture, families routinely followed these salt routes. The road built to haul salt from Goose Creek to the Wilderness Road is a prime example.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it became a primary artery for movement. Families migrated along these corridors looking for work at the furnaces or seeking credit at the company stores, or even just following kin who had already relocated.
So let's say you are tracing a family, and an ancestor just suddenly vanishes from eastern Tennessee in the 1850s. The instinct is to search every adjacent county in Tennessee.
Right, which is what most people do.
But the supply chains for these major centers completely ignored state boundaries. That family living in western North Carolina or eastern Tennessee might be trading and interacting entirely with the salt hub in southwestern Virginia.
Exactly. Modern researchers trap themselves by restricting their searches to modern county or state lines. Your ancestors were following the salt roads. If you map the physical route to the nearest hub, you suddenly know exactly where to look for them next.
That geographic reality sets up the catastrophe perfectly. These 4 hubs were the lifeblood of the entire upland South. And then the war arrives, and the coastal blockades successfully cut off imported salt.
Yep, the supply just drops to zero.
So the Confederacy is forced to look inward, right at those 4 Appalachian hubs. They become massive, high-value military targets.
And Union operations move in and deliberately target these sites to cripple the southern supply chain. They hit the Kanawha salt works after the Battle of Carnifex Ferry. They launch operations into eastern Kentucky and hit Goose Creek.
They just wipe them out.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Military units literally marched in, smashed the giant boiling kettles, burned the sheds to the ground, and destroyed the stockpiles.
So the military targets the industrial hubs, but the immediate devastating fallout hits the family kitchen. I mean, the burden of that famine fell almost entirely on women, right?
Okay.
Because they were managing household food security while many of the men were away fighting.
Yeah, you have to consider the mechanics of the agricultural calendar here. Fall approaches. You wait for the first hard frost, which is the traditional time for butchering hogs and curing meat to survive the winter.
Right, the seasonal routine.
But when you butcher a hog, you need salt immediately to draw out the moisture. Without it, the meat rots in a matter of days. Suddenly, the entire region realizes there is no salt to be had.
They had to make agonizing decisions. Delaying the fall butchering risks the animals starving during the winter, but slaughtering them without a preservative meant the meat would just spoil.
It was a lose-lose situation, and the livestock that did survive saw their health plummet because there were no salt licks available. The few bushels of salt that were available skyrocketed to astronomical prices.
Hold on, I need to push back on this from a research perspective. If salt is essentially gold at this point, and families are desperate, aren't the resulting records going to be incredibly messy?
What do you mean?
Well, how can a genealogist actually trust a ration list or a post-war damage claim if there is a massive financial incentive for people to lie or exaggerate their need?
Oh, that is a crucial, critical thinking step. You are right that desperation breeds exaggeration, but the local governments actually anticipated that.
They did.
Yeah. Because the crisis was so widespread, counties realized their citizens were going to starve and riot, so they formed official salt committees to manage the meager supplies, and they actively policed the claims.
Oh, so there was a verification mechanism in place at the county level.
Yes, exactly. These committees generated ration lists, and they prioritized widows and the families of soldiers. Local clerks and appointed men would physically verify the household size and the level of need.
That's incredibly helpful.
It really is. For a researcher today, these lists act as a highly accurate quasi-census of the most vulnerable households in 1862 and 1863. You get the head of household, the family size, and notes about their specific economic reality.
And local courts were stepping in to manage the economics, too. If you look at the county court minutes from places near the hubs, like Perry County, Kentucky, home to the Leatherwood Works, you see the court officially capping the price of salt at $5 a bushel in late 1862.
Which was still a lot of money back then.
Oh, for sure. They explicitly appointed local men to police the precincts and prevent hoarding, or what they called engrossing.
The sheer panic forced local government to document the rationing and aggressively police the pricing.
Now, with local courts capping prices and rationing out every pinch of salt, the pressure on the actual producers must have been unimaginable. I mean, the demand didn't stop just because a Union cavalry unit smashed the kettles.
Right. People still needed to eat.
Somebody still had to try and produce whatever salt they could from the damaged hubs. Who was actually doing the back-breaking work of boiling this brine?
Well, the salt works operated at a harsh intersection of elite capital and intense physical labor. You had wealthy families like the Garrards and the Langfords in Clay County who built massive fortunes on Goose Creek salt.
But they weren't the ones chopping wood.
No, not at all. The actual brutal work, chopping the thousands of cords of wood needed for the furnaces, tending the boiling kettles in the dead of winter, packing the barrels, that was heavily reliant on enslaved labor.
Because this required such a massive workforce, these owners weren't just using their own enslaved populations, right? They were constantly leasing people from across the region to keep up with production.
Yeah, and that leasing system is what generates the paper trail. The sheer scale of the operation required meticulous record keeping.
Interesting.
The salt companies had to draft detailed labor contracts and maintain personnel lists to track who they were leasing for how much and from whom.
Finding specific occupational details for Black ancestors during this era can be incredibly difficult because records are often scarce or intentionally vague. But these industrial sites force a level of administrative detail that is profoundly valuable today.
Absolutely. In these surviving archival collections, which are usually held in university archives or state historical societies, you will find documents that list enslaved workers right alongside hired white hands.
So they actually list names.
Yes. The records provide actual names and assign them specific industrial roles. You can see exactly who was working as a wagoner, who was the cooper building the barrels, and who was assigned to the wood-cutting crews.
Wow. And the chronological paper trail is unbroken from pre-war production to wartime destruction. Because when the Union Army destroyed those works, the owners and investors turned around and filed massive claims for compensation.
Exactly. And in those post-war testimonies, the owners had to detail everything they lost. To justify their financial claims, they frequently listed the kin, the wage workers, and the enslaved people who were working those specific sites when the destruction occurred.
What's fascinating here is that you are finding the specific names of the enslaved individuals who are quite literally keeping the upland South from starving by producing this critical preservative.
It's incredible history.
So we have the government rationing the remaining supply, and we have laborers desperately trying to rebuild production. But this completely derails everyday commerce. As Confederate paper money rapidly depreciated, the traditional cash economy just collapsed.
Overnight, basically.
It makes me think of a modern power grid failing. When the central system dies, people instantly fall back on whatever physical, localized assets they have on hand. Salt essentially became the new currency of Appalachia.
It really did. The sheer desperation for a preservative forced a sudden, massive shift to a barter system. Land, timber, and labor were all traded directly for salt.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources we reviewed highlight an 1863 deed from Clay County, Kentucky, that illustrates this perfectly. A family literally trades a tract of land, actual real estate, for 50 bushels of good salt to be delivered when the works be running.
I mean, land was useless to you if your family was going to starve that winter because you couldn't preserve your meat. That deed captures not just the terrifying value of the commodity, but the deep uncertainty of the war.
Right. That specific phrasing.
Yeah, that phrase, when the works be running, acknowledges that the local salt site was likely destroyed or occupied at the exact time the contract was signed.
This barter economy seeped into every corner of local law. If you open country store ledgers from this period, the cash transactions disappear. You see an open account system where a family buys a tiny amount of salt on credit, and the ledger tracks them, repaying that debt in eggs, timber, or physical labor over the course of months.
And when those informal agreements inevitably broke down, they flooded the county court dockets. The court saw a huge spike in suits on account, petitions for debt recovery, and replevin actions over things like livestock.
The replevin actions are fascinating to me because a local dispute over a salt debt suddenly turns into a lawsuit over a cow, and the resulting testimony creates a localized social web for the genealogist.
Oh, it's a gold mine.
Neighbors are called to the stand to testify about who hauled salt from which works, who owed what to whom, and why a specific family couldn't pay as promised. You get a front row seat to the economic survival tactics of the neighborhood.
You also see this economic struggle mapped out clearly in estate inventories.
Right. If you look at an estate inventory from the fall of 1863, the red flag isn't what's there, it's what isn't. The usual massive store of cured meat that you would expect a family to have prepared for the winter is just gone.
Replaced by salt.
Exactly. Instead, you see a couple of barrels of salt valued at astronomical prices.
You might even see an estate explicitly listing a deceased person's interest in a salt contract as a piece of property to be inherited. Guardians are shown spending exorbitant amounts of an orphan's inheritance just to secure basic provisions. The legal documents reflect the complete inversion of the local economy.
The records are incredibly rich. But because this terminology infiltrated every type of document, from land deeds to orphan accounts, modern researchers trip over the wording all the time.
They really do.
Novices see phrases like, "at the salt works," and completely misinterpret them. It's like looking at a census and assuming someone's last name is Factory just because the clerk wrote that they work at the factory.
It is one of the most common pitfalls. A researcher will see a note in a margin that says a man went to the Lick, and they will assume Lick is a neighboring township. Or they'll see John at the salt works and think his surname is Saltworks.
Which seems silly, but it happens.
All the time. You have to understand that these phrases describe industrial sites or tasks, not surnames or municipal towns.
The local dialects make it even trickier because county clerks were often recording spoken testimony verbatim.
Yeah, you get these incredible raw glimpses of Appalachian dialect preserved right there in the archives. You will read phrases like, salt high's the sky, or couldn't get no salt, or had to go over yonder to the works.
I love that.
Me too. But if you don't recognize those as dialect markers describing the journey to the local salt hub, you will completely misunderstand the context of the legal document.
There's also a major political trap here regarding loyalty. Appalachia during the Civil War was famously divided, with control of the salt works shifting back and forth between Union and Confederate forces.
Right, it was constantly changing hands.
So if a researcher finds a record of an ancestor rendering a tax in kind of salt to the Confederate government, or hauling salt for the Confederate Army, they might automatically assume that ancestor was a staunch Confederate.
And this raises an important question about how we interpret political loyalty during a crisis. You cannot read these records as simple declarations of ideology. Families were balancing on a knife's edge just to survive the winter.
They were basically selling their labor or their goods to whoever was currently holding the guns.
Exactly. Finding an ancestor rendering a salt tax to the Confederacy, or finding them later filing a Union damage claim because their works were destroyed, well, it usually reflects wartime compulsion, not strict ideological loyalty. They were forced to comply with whoever occupied the territory that month.
We tend to project our modern desire for clear-cut heroes and villains onto people who are literally just trying to keep their children from starving. To get an accurate picture of what your ancestor was actually doing, you have to triangulate the data.
Yes. You take the 1860 census and agricultural schedules from right before the war, and you compare them to the 1870 schedules from after the war. You look for sudden, anomalous occupation shifts.
Like what?
Well, did your ancestor go from being listed as a regular farmer in 1860 to suddenly being listed as a salt maker, a cooper, or a wagoner during the decade? If they did, that shift aligns perfectly with the rise of the barter economy during the shortage.
Well, that makes so much sense.
And it gives you a clear roadmap for which specific business ledgers and court records to search for in between those census years.
For the listener right now, realizing that their ancestors were in one of these 13 Appalachian states between 1861 and 1865, the roadmap to verify these links requires stepping outside the standard genealogical databases.
Oh, absolutely. The simplest step is to correlate local county records with regional maps. Pull the deeds, the tax lists, and the court minutes for your ancestors' county. Then, lay those next to a historical map or gazetteer.
And find the hubs.
Right. Locate the nearest of the four major hubs: Saltville, Kanawha, Goose Creek, or Leatherwood. Trace the rivers and the turnpikes between your ancestors' county and that hub.
So what does this all mean? Because once you map the physical route they had to take to get the salt, you know exactly which neighboring counties to check for court disputes or store ledgers.
Not exactly.
And from there, you can scale up to the state level. The state legislative journals and the adjutant general records show the massive state-level salt contracts and the official price regulations. You frequently find local ancestors named as the local agents contracted to haul that state-purchased salt back to their home district.
The key is cross-referencing. The story is never in just one deed.
Earlier, we discussed how the burden of this famine fell heavily on the women managing the households. Yet the formal state contracts, the land deeds, and the business ledgers are almost exclusively in the men's names. How do researchers find the women who are holding these families together?
That's a great point. This requires an understanding of how 19th century social safety nets functioned. Because there was no federal welfare system, local congregations and county courts operated as the ultimate safety net.
So where do you look?
To find the women, you have to look at local relief records. You go to the county archives and specifically ask for the overseers of the poor records, and more importantly, you look at local church minutes.
Because the churches were stepping in to manage the fallout of the famine.
Right. Churches distributed aid to widows and the wives of soldiers, and their ledgers essentially became a de facto census for marginalized women. They meticulously recorded the distribution of provisions, explicitly mentioning aid given in the form of salt.
That's amazing.
It is. These community-level documents are where the names of these women finally become visible in the archival record.
We started this deep dive looking at a simple salt shaker. But when you examine the 1862 crisis, You see how the sudden absence of this one commodity became the engine driving everything else.
It really touched every part of life.
It forced the creation of new taxes, it birthed complex barter economies where real estate was traded for seasoning, and it dictated the cross-border migrations of families across the entire Appalachian region. It reveals how fundamentally interconnected survival, industry, and the law truly were.
And it leaves you with a final thought to mull over long after this deep dive is done. If a temporary shortage of a simple table seasoning was powerful enough to dictate where your ancestors moved, who they sued in court, and how they survived, if it could do all of that, what completely mundane, everyday item in your own household right now, something you don't even think twice about, might one day tell the definitive story of your life to future historians?
That is wild to think about. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. Until next time, keep questioning the mundane.
Thank you for listening to this installment of the Appalachian Historical Review. Remember to visit the digital archive at AppalachianGenealogy.com. Join us next time for further study into the records and history of the Appalachian region.